Hello and welcome from me, Harry Lye, to a new edition of the Shephard Defence Podcast. This week we feature my discussion with Saab Defence Sales Manager Chris Lade about the challenges of seabed warfare. And we'll also be chatting to our training reporter, Norbert Neumann, who is joining us all the way from sunny Florida, although I assume it's sunny. It might not be. Hello, Norbert. How are you doing?
Hey, Harry. Yeah, it's quite sunny, a little muggy too, but definitely a nice weather in the end of November, beginning of December.
Definitely sunnier than it is here. I'm quite miserable in my Victorian flat with damp on the walls and condensated windows. So I'm sure you're having a much nicer time than I am. So I suppose, ITSEC's probably the thing that most people are talking about at the moment, being the kind of big trade show on. So what's been happening? What's been the highlights?
Yeah, it's my first ITSEC, and it was very exciting to be here. Loads of things are happening, and obviously, since it's my first one, I don't have a perspective. I don't know how previous ones were, but it's loads of things are going on. Distributed computing companies are a big thing. Obviously, VR is hanging from every booth. Simulations, small footprint simulators. I think that was, one of the key themes. All companies trying to sort of come up with the solutions for aircraft, mainly aircraft, that would allow militaries to train on a smaller footprint. And to talk about some concretes, F-35 simulator from Lockheed Martin, they have a prototype that they displayed at their booth. It's not fielded anywhere currently besides Lockheed Martin's lab, but that would allow any F-35 customer to train their pilots for mission rehearsal and sort of any sort of training scenarios that don't necessarily require a high fidelity. I think it's deployable. MRT was used on the HMS Queen Elizabeth last year. Probably you know much more about that than I do.
So yeah, that all sounds very interesting. I must admit, I'd quite like to have a go on an F-35 simulator myself, although I don't think I'd be very good at it. Also, in our little chat before this, you were telling me that there was some news from some BAE.
Don't worry, Harry. I always crash all these F-35 simulators just for the fun of it. And in terms of BAE Systems, yes, there was a very interesting announcement from BAE Systems and Red 6, a Florida-based company. The partners announced that they will explore how to integrate an augmented reality system onto the Hawk fastjet trainer. They would use Red 6's advanced tactical augmented reality system, or ATARS, and it would sort of, the goal is to enhance pilot training while airborne, right? Pilots would be able to see, identify, engage virtual threats, and also cooperate with virtual wingmen, all while airborne. And it's the reason why this is particularly exciting is that augmented reality system is a fairly widespread technology now in military training, but never really outdoors, right? Because you can't really have mixed reality in an outdoor environment. You have too much light, and just an infrastructure usually it doesn't really permit these kind of things. And Red 6 sort of solved this problem. They appeared on the horizon around 2020. And their first major contract was in 2021 with the U.S. Air Force. And they were contracted to integrate the very same ATAR system on the T-38 Talon. And when I talked to Daniel Robinson, the founder and CEO of Red 6, he said that it's virtually the exact same system, but obviously the Hawk and the T-38 are different aircraft, so they will require some tweaks and different sort of implantation techniques, but they haven't finished integration on the T-38 yet, so he couldn't really give an answer as to what lessons they learned from that project. But they said, BAE Systems and Red 6 said that they will try to complete this integration as soon as possible. And when I asked Lucy Walton, the head of training at BAE Systems, that whether BAE Systems considers this program as a sort of preliminary work for the Tempest or the UK FCAS fighter jet program, because we know that BAE Systems is working on the FCAS, and we don't exactly know how the FCAS is going to look like, or the Tempest, but we know that the aircraft's cockpit is going to be very different from a cockpit that we know now. And one of the main elements is the headset or the helmet that will have sort of augmented reality systems into it, and the pilots will be able to interact with the cockpit just by looking at certain things. Anyway, that's the sort of idea that we got from BAE Systems back in the days when they started talking about Tempest. And they wouldn't only use that for training system, just like they would want to do it now with the Hawk, but they would actually pilots would actually fly the aircraft and use that system for various bits.
And for those of us that are maybe a little bit more ignorant as to kind of why that's important, if you're a pilot, why? I know you've written a lot about the kind of the mixing of live and virtual training and things like that. So kind of what's the benefit of putting augmented reality and allowing a pilot to kind of train while in the air? How does that make their experience better?
Just like with most programs nowadays, right, and also outside of the training realm, saving money, right, becoming more efficient and saving money. If you fly alone on a training mission and have 2-3 virtual assets flying up there with you, as opposed to having 2-3 other platforms taken out, or flying, or taken 2-3 pilots and maybe 1-2 instructors out of there, that just saves enormous amount of money. And as we know, air forces across the globe face a massive problem of fast jet pilot training. And obviously this in the Hawk, this would be integrated in the Hawk, and that's not only a Royal Air Force platform, but being used by Canada, Saudi Arabia, Zimbabwe, Indonesia, Finland, India, and some other countries.
Great. So, I mean, it sounds like it's been a busy week, and I know you caught a basketball game as well, so that must have been good fun. So, I mean, obviously, it's not just the Americans that do training, and I hear that there's been some interesting news on the UK front as well for the British Army, right?
Oh, absolutely. CTTP is one of the main topics of discussion these days when it comes to the British Army. CTTP stands for Collective Training Transformation Program. It's a 10-15 year contract. It's going to be when in 2025 the winner is selected. Initial 10 years for around £600 million, and then an additional 5 years for around £250 million. And the first company that officially announced that it would bid for the program was Raytheon UK. They named their team Omnia Training, and Raytheon UK partnered with Servus, Capita, Improbable Defence, and Rheinmetall. They announced it just before the show, a few days before the show on the Friday, and they said they are very well positioned to carry out this program for the British Army, given that Raytheon UK has a huge experience in delivering complex training programs for the UK, and that includes Selborne, which is the most expensive training modernization program the UK has ever awarded for the Navy, and Raytheon also leads DCT, which is the Dreadnought Crew Training Program. Both of these programs can be quite familiar to our readers, because recently I wrote about some developments on those programs. Another company that announced that it would bid for CTTP was Kinetic. Kinetic is partnering with KBR and PA Consulting, and they said that they would bring a truly collaborative and a common vision approach to the British Army's requirement. And just like Raytheon UK-led training program, partners are very clear. The companies are very clear that this is not necessarily the final team, right? There's still in discussion with other industry members, and just as the requirements for the CTTP will change, as again, it's a 10-15 year contract or effort. The teams will also change as well.
And so, what's the British Army trying to achieve with CTTP? I don't know. I think I maybe got one extra T there. What are they trying to kind of get out of it? What's the point in having this kind of big new training solution?
The knowing answer is that we don't exactly know, right? The requirements are not clarified. The MOD, when I talked to the MOD last time, they said that they will be releasing official requirements in January. I presume, and it's only me assuming, they have released some of the requirements a bit earlier than expected. But again, because it's going to be a constantly evolving training program, requirements will shift over time. But I think one important element of it is to, as we know, that the British Army is shrinking, right? It's sort of getting reduced in size, and the budget allocated for the British Army and for the British Army's training is shrinking with current economic circumstances. That's just even, that's even exacerbated. And so one of the key goals is to get soldiers to the front line much faster, but it would obviously, as it's in its name, it wouldn't only go down to the individual level, but to go up to the collective level, brigades training together, and so on. And initially, CTTP will only focus on land, but the MOD is not hiding its intentions to sort of network and integrate all its forces together at some point in the future. But again, this is probably going to be quite down the line, right? But the goal would be to have the British Army, Royal Navy, and the Royal Air Force trained together, and potentially also bring in cyber and space elements in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Norbert. And just before we let you go and enjoy the rest of your lovely Florida afternoon, is there anything else on the radar?
I think it's worth mentioning Vario and VR Geners. They are the two biggest companies on headsets or head-mounted devices, VR and XR head-mounted devices. I mentioned small footprint F-35 simulator. The prototype of the F-35 small footprint simulator that Lockheed Martin showed me, and I managed to crash. VR Geners has a sort of F-35-like simulator, as Polczak, the CEO and founder of VR Geners, told me. It gives opportunities for customers who sign for F-35 and other advanced fighter jets. Gives them the opportunity to start training, mission rehearsal, and communication techniques, and all the sort of training requirements that don't necessarily require high fidelity simulator. And while they wait for the actual full mission simulators and the aircraft, they can start training with them, right? So they showed their classroom trainer at ITSEC. This was the second iteration of their costume trainer. They have sold 6 to a South African flight training company around 6 months ago, and now they showed their Apache, F-35, F-16 simulators at the show.
Great, thanks, Norbert. That's it sounds like you've had an interesting week, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't jealous and wished I was there with you. But luckily, next week you'll be back in the newsroom and miserable and cold like the rest of us. So, and moving on to some other stories, as the naval reporter, I'd be remiss if I didn't plug some of my own work, given the opportunity. And there's been some interesting developments on the Royal Navy front, particularly with the final selection of a new anti-ship missile for the surface fleet in the Kongsberg Naval Strike Missile. And there's also been the launch of the the start of the launch of the first Type 26 frigate. But for all the details on those stories and more, you can head to our website www.shephardmedia.com. That's www.shephardmedia.com. Now, when multiple leaks sprung on the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines this summer, governments and navies were reminded of the threat posed to seabed infrastructure. For Saab's defence sales manager Chris Lade, this was a big focus for the company during Euronaval in Paris. There, he spoke to reporters, including myself, and outlined the challenges of seabed warfare, including depth, power, and communications. At the end of November, I sat down with him to chat through some of these challenges in detail. Joining me now is Chris Lade from Saab. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hi, Harry. Really good to be here.
So, first of all, thank you for taking the time to come on and speak to all of our listeners about the world of seabed warfare and the challenges of defence at depth. I think is a good way to put it. But I suppose a good place to start would be if you could just kind of tell our listeners a bit of your experience and kind of how that gives you an interest in the domain.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. So I've been working with Saab now for the last 10 years in their underwater systems department. But before that, I had 30 years in the Royal Navy, starting as a clearance diver, so diving under the water, and later becoming an underwater warfare specialist. So I had a background in the military underwater world, and then for the last 10 years with Saab, I've been working in both the military but also in the commercial underwater world. And I think that you will see, perhaps as we go through the podcast, that what the commercial world does in the underwater space is directly relevant to what the defence world wants to do going forward.
Absolutely. I suppose it's one of those interesting fields where the two are much more intertwined than they are in other domains, especially given all of the infrastructure at sea that's, I suppose, mostly run by commercial enterprises. But there's then the question of kind of whose right it is to protect it. So in the introduction to this chat, I mentioned the Nord Stream pipeline incidents in the earlier on this year in the summer. So I just wondered if there were any other kind of highlights in the seabed warfare domain from this year that have kind of really helped bring it to the forefront of people's discussions.
I think there's probably three that I'd pick out, and one a sort of operational one, and early in this year, in the Northern Atlantic, up north, in the sort of Norwegian area, a Norwegian listening device had a large section of cable that just sort of disappeared, and nobody really knows how that's happened. So that's a sort of live incident. Then in February, the French Navy launched its strategy paper on seabed warfare, which was a significant step. There are a number of navies also that are really gearing up towards seabed warfare, I think it's fair to say, and that's been happening very much this year. And then in May, the Royal Navy ran a seabed warfare workshop in the UK, where they brought together all the sort of commercial companies. Actually, Saab assisted in that. We facilitated and brought our commercial contacts so that they could sort of demonstrate what the commercial space is doing on the seabed.
And so I suppose that's probably the topic we'll end up speaking about the most today, that kind of interaction between the commercial and defence world going forward. But so I suppose a good place to start then, just to give listeners a bit of a background to draw upon, is kind of when we're talking about seabed warfare and the different depths, navies, where are they going down to, and why are commercial sectors perhaps better placed to help them kind of find solutions to some of these challenges that they're faced with?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's fair to say that navies have been doing seabed warfare for a very long time, a form of seabed warfare. And Captain Cook was doing hydrography in the Pacific back in the 18th century, and mine warfare, which is another form of seabed warfare, arguably, down to about 200 meters. that's been going on certainly all over the last century and before. There's been mines, but as you've already said, the increased amount of underwater infrastructure on the seabed is changing, or is bringing a different aspect to seabed warfare, and it's to deal with that infrastructure. And the infrastructure is surely down to 200 meters, but goes much further than that. And it seems that navies, a number of navies across the globe, are interested in going down to a sort of magic number of 6,000 meters. Now, if we compare that with what is done at the moment routinely in the commercial world operates routinely down to 3,000 meters, I think it's fair to say. So there's a difference there, but obviously the infrastructure is getting deeper and deeper, and the needs of defence is to go deeper with all the challenges that brings.
So then, if you're a navy and you're operating, you're used to operating in the hundreds of meters, and now we're thinking of 3,000, even double that down to 6,000 meters. I suppose the leads to the question is kind of self-explanatory as to the infrastructure side, but why would you want to go down there? What does it allow you to do that maybe you couldn't do before?
Well, I think that it all goes back to what is perceived as the threat. And if the threat is for an adversary to interdict your infrastructure, the infrastructure just doesn't stop at 200 meters. It goes on beyond. If it's coming across the Atlantic or going across the Pacific, it has to go deep. I was talking with the French Navy only this week, in actual fact. And if you look at a chart off of Brest, where they operate their submarines from, you don't have to go very far from Brest to drop off the continental shelf, and suddenly you're in significant depth. So if your adversary has the ability to go deep and therefore threatens your infrastructure, you need to go deep as well, whether that is just to monitor your infrastructure or actually to arguably prevent an adversary doing something to your infrastructure.
Right. So that's kind of then, yes, self-explanatory of why you want to go down there. And as we've reported quite extensively on the past about just the sheer amount of kind of economic trade communications that relies on cables, pipelines, and other infrastructure on the seabed. So we touched on adversaries there. Do you think there's a kind of a gulf between, let's say, offensive abilities in the seabed domain and defensive abilities?
Well, I think it's fair to say that some nations have the capability to conduct offensive seabed warfare. And they've had that capability for some time. The increasing reliance on seabed infrastructure makes that a greater threat, arguably. I think that's a reasonable sort of conclusion to come to. And there are nations that are out there actively doing seabed operations. It's a known fact. And that there are nations with specific assets designed to go deep today.
And so I suppose one of the things that kind of I always think of when it comes to seabed warfare is, since the first telegram cables were laid across the Atlantic Ocean years and years and years ago, there seems to have only been recently that it's come up more in discussions about the fact that we need capabilities down at the seabed to protect cables. And maybe that's a result of incidents that have occurred and potential sabotage. But do you think there's a reason that potentially it's really coming to the forefront now and that it hasn't been more actively pursued in the past?
I think I think I go back to the point that there's just more infrastructure down there now. And arguably, I think the other thing is we're more dependent on that infrastructure. So the sort of infrastructure we're talking about, communications cables. Okay, I think, I'm not absolutely sure of my facts, but we're talking about trillions of pounds worth of transactions daily coming across internet cables into the UK alone. So, if you cut those off, the economy is going to be affected in some way. How catastrophically or not is another question, but it will be affected. You've seen the Nord Stream issue, an energy pipeline. Energy is obviously in the news at the moment, the cost of energy, oil, gas. So if you cut a pipeline off, again, it's going to hit economies and it's going to hit them quite quickly. But I think, and power cables with regards to electricity, the same. But I think that going forward, there's going to be more varieties of infrastructure on the seabed with arguably tidal energy generation from the seabed, arguably the ability to store data on the seabed because water keeps it cool. So you can have data nodes on the seabed and so on and so forth. So the seabed becomes a more and more critical space for nations and for nations to operate in. And unfortunately, the way that the human race operates, if it's a critical national infrastructure or national domain, then other people, adversaries, will want to be involved in it.
So if I'm a European Navy and I'm looking at these cables and pipelines, and then in knowing that 10 years down the line, there's going to be data nodes, like you said, tidal energy sources, more offshore wind farms to protect, all of which could be tampered with. What capabilities do I need to look after it?
Okay, well, let's talk about the defensive aspect of this. So protecting your own infrastructure. And the first thing you need to have is the ability to monitor your infrastructure. And in actual fact, navies do that already in the mine warfare world and in the hydrographic world. So they monitor the seabed by doing hydrographic surveys, but more so in the mine warfare world. The routes that navies would take at any time of hostility are surveyed, and then repeat surveys are conducted to see over a period of time to see if anything has changed. I think you can mirror that in the seabed warfare. So you survey your infrastructure, and indeed that's done by commercial companies already. But you need to know if something's been done or something's been placed on your infrastructure. So you repeat that survey and compare the two and see what's changed. So that's the sort of area to begin with. And if you like, the easy part. And then in some way, at particularly critical points, you might want to station, let's say, a sentry. Now, that sentry might be some form of listening device, or it might be some form of underwater robot, what's known as an unmanned underwater vehicle, a UUV. And there are two particular types of those, a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV, and an autonomous underwater vehicle, an AUV. And I think those are arguably the slightly more advanced. You can use those to do the survey aspect, but you then move into the next phase of a defensive operation, which is if someone's down there and done something, you need to go and do something to your pipeline or cable or whatever the infrastructure is. And you'll need a robot probably to do that.
And given the lengths of, say, these pipelines, the amount of seabed that navies are going to have to cover, is this really where technology from the commercial sector steps in to be able to provide these AUVs, RUVs, UUVs that are all needed to keep tabs on what's going on?
Yes, I think so. It's fair to say that navies are using AUVs and ROVs already today, but not in this way. And I think it's also fair to say that over the last 40 years, because of the fact that the commercial world works 24/7 in those areas, they're probably, and this is debatable, but they're probably the experts. So the systems that they're using are transferable. There are AUVs today able to go down to 6,000 meters. It's not the norm, but there are out there, and they're regularly produced by some companies. And those AUVs, or indeed the ones that work shallower, will carry a sensor suite, predominantly sonar, but other sensors as well, which will survey the pipeline and record the data that they pick up.
And so that monitoring part is clearly important in the defensive aspect. But in terms of kind of countering nefarious activity, if you catch a system or in the act of sabotage, kind of as you're on a routine patrol, or you find something that's placed on the pipeline, how complicated is it from a robotics perspective or a systems perspective to actually have systems that can do something about it when you're so far down?
Okay, well, I mean, it's fair to say that ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. So if we try to draw the distinction between what does an AUV do and what does an ROV do, in broad terms, and it is broad terms, an AUV does survey, so sort of search work. An ROV does interdiction, so it does intervention, or it does a job, if you like. It will use a tool or use a manipulator arm to cause an effect. There are some vehicles which can do both those things. But it then comes down to the requirement. The need for a search means you generally need a hydrodynamic vehicle which has long endurance and is a stable platform so it can operate its sensor suite. From the ROV perspective, you need a vehicle which can go down to the job and operate in a relatively reduced radius using manipulator arms or tooling to actually effect what needs to be repaired or taken away or whatever the task might be.
And so it certainly seems with some of the incidents that have cropped up that kind of from an adversary's ability to cause an effect on infrastructure, that kind of some level of plausible deniability seems to be quite an important aspect of seabed warfare. So just by having those monitoring capabilities and being able to spot if something's happened sooner than perhaps we can at the moment, do you think that gives a kind of a deterrent effect?
I think it must do. That there was a Dutch admiral I saw on YouTube, a recent YouTube film, who spoke about the fact that at crucial, critical nodes, communication nodes, we see activity on the surface. So that's a clue that something might be going on underneath. But of course, there's the ability to act completely covertly, perhaps from a submarine, and interdict underwater infrastructure. So the deterrent aspect of potentially placing a sensor suite that can listen for activity on your infrastructure, or indeed, and this is where there is a new development in the AUV, ROV world, a resident underwater vehicle that could act almost as a sentry and could be cued perhaps by a sensor and go off and do some form of exploratory to see if something is going on its infrastructure. Now, that's speculation on my part. There are underwater resident vehicles out there today. and they're operating today in the commercial sector. The sort of extension of that capability into the defence world and seabed warfare hasn't yet happened. But could it happen? I would say yes.
And so I take it kind of like having a forward operating base near a country, an army or a navy or an air force might be operating in, kind of gives you the same head start that you're closer to where you want to be with say a resident system.
Yeah, absolutely. And the two things you need from the resident system are communications to the garage, which is effectively where the robot lives, and power. So the robot takes its power from its batteries. You need to recharge those batteries. And you need, when you've collected data or you want to send the robot on a mission, it can do the mission autonomously, but clearly it needs to be told where to go and what to do. And if it's speculative, i.e. something's happened and it needs to respond, or it's a responsive mission, you have to tell it where to go and how that response should be conducted.
And so it's something I've written about in the past is the challenges of underwater communications. And that's whenever I've spoken to people, it's always been at kind of submarine depths. So of a couple of 100 meters where kind of things like optical lasers and other technology plays a role. But if you're down at 6,000 meters, how much of a challenge is it to pass some kind of instruction to an AUV or like you said, a resident system?
Yeah, so let's talk underwater communications. And you're absolutely right. Difficult. It's communications through air is relatively straightforward. Communications, as soon as you touch the water column, becomes far more challenging. Depends on temperature, salinity, and a whole range of other different things. So I think that what you would need to have, I think there are two scenarios for the underwater resident capability, let's say. One is you're operating in home waters, and one you're operating in not home waters. So arguably an adversary's waters, or it could be neutral waters. It's not close to land, let's say. In land, when you're close to land, communications is relatively straightforward because you would simply have some form of fibre optic cable that would connect into your garage, along with a power cable that would inductively pass communications to the ROV and inductively recharge the batteries of I said ROV, probably an AUV, my mistake. If you're operating away from close to land, so further out to sea, 6,000 meters, you would need to communicate, I would suggest, by a buoy. So you would need to put a buoy up, either transmit your data back to mother, or mother transmit your tasking through the buoy and then recover the buoy back to the garage. As I say, that's not been done yet, but that's how I, as a simple ex-sailor, would say was the way you would do that. With regards to power, when you're not able to take a cable, there are a range of different options which have, and a lot of work is ongoing in how you could deliver tidal powered generators, hydrogen cells, and a range of different other things that could deliver the power you need to recharge the batteries of your robot.
So all very complex, but like you say, there's solutions there that kind of certainly be interesting to see how they play out. And so we've discussed the defensive side. Then the other side of the coin is actually doing something offensive with seabed warfare capabilities and kind of taking a less passive approach as potentially as a navy, but looking to do something to someone else's infrastructure or act further away from yourself and to kind of enhance that deterrent. So how different are the capabilities that you need to do something offensively to defensively?
I think the requirement once you're on the seabed is very similar. If, with respect that you will still need to do let's say we're talking about some form of expeditionary operation. You will need to do some form of monitoring of your adversary's infrastructure. That's the same as you would need to do if it was your own infrastructure. So the same sort of sensor suites, probably over a smaller area, I think it's fair to say, because you'd be more targeted, perhaps. But then when you've done that, what do you want to do next? And rather than the sort of mend or repair or remove function which you have in the defensive role, in an expeditionary role, it's more of a break or place or interdict that system in some way to stop it doing what it's there to do. I think that's probably a fair assumption. But I think the real key, as I've said, once you're there, similar requirements, but it's getting there, which is the fundamental difference. And clearly, whilst in a large number of cases on a defensive operation in your own homeland waters, let's say, you can be overt. Certain circumstances you might not want to be overt because you don't want to give away where you're operating in homeland waters. But certainly from an offensive expeditionary point of view, you will need to be covert. And there you have the issue of how do you place your seabed warfare system, be it ROV or AUV, on the seabed without being detected. And I think there, at the present time, there are probably two potential solutions. The first one is the more conventional solution, the submarine, and we can talk about that in a little more detail. But the other, and the more, well, the less conventional, I suppose it's fair to say, is the extra large UUV. So a very large unmanned underwater vehicle, which is able to carry a mission module, which would be your interdicting system, be that ROV or AUV. And I think that's the fundamental difference between expeditionary, offensive, and defensive. It's that covert requirement to get your system in place.
And so you mentioned, we'll start with the submarines, I suppose, as the way of getting there, because that's what probably most people have more of an understanding of. So would you essentially just kind of shoot a system out of the torpedo tubes? Kind of, how does that play and how does that interact?
Yeah, well, pretty much. I mean, it's not. I don't know. There may be out there. I don't know myself of a system that is able to do that right now today. There have been trials and development has been done about the ability to launch an autonomous underwater vehicle out of a submarine through a conventional 21-inch torpedo tube. I don't think that, and that's not particularly difficult. An AUV, an autonomous underwater vehicle, is pretty much fire and forget because you've programmed its mission. It will go off and do it. The challenge is then when it's finished its mission, either recovering it back to the submarine or it downloading its data. It could come to the surface and communicate in that way. The really interesting point is when you actually come to do some work where you need a man in the loop doing the work, and that's when you need direct communications, not necessarily immediate, but not a huge delay in communicating to the ROV and the ROV actually doing the work. And I don't think there are any systems out there right now that can do that. There have been some sort of R&D projects in it, and I know Saab itself has been involved in one of those successfully, so it can be done, but it's not necessarily a product right now. But you look at, in addition to in addition, the new designs of submarine, some submarines incorporate a much larger torpedo tube, if you will, a sort of mission bay, where you can actually dispatch unmanned underwater vehicles from that mission bay.
Yes, immediately the one that comes to mind is the A26, and I've written quite extensively about the portal on that. So definitely an interesting one to watch out for, especially if submarine designs kind of in future look to incorporate these capabilities as well. And so the other thing you mentioned was XLUUVs. So that technology, kind of, how far of a step away is it from what we know a submarine to be? And kind of, is that kind of an area that you think is really going to see a lot of development and a lot of interest moving forward?
Undoubtedly, and they're there already today and operating today. I think it's probably fair to say that the US, from a Western perspective, has led the sort of charge on that, if you will. Boeing has systems, Lockheed have systems. We've worked with Boeing on what might be incorporated in the mission module bay, and they've done extensive long excursions or missions, if you will, so going out into the Pacific and conducting missions there. So they're out there doing it, and of course you've got the advantage that they're cheaper than a submarine. They're unmanned, which is an advantage and obviously a disadvantage as well. So yes, I think I certainly think they'll be used more extensively going forward.
Great. So I think that's kind of given our listeners quite a broad picture on what's going on the seabed, from kind of the top level challenges all the way through to some of the technology and what's on the horizon. So just wondered if you had any final thoughts before I let you go.
I think it's a hugely challenging area. It's and one of the points that makes it particularly challenging is there's a little confusion amongst countries as to who owns what on the seabed. Obviously, if it's a pipeline, it's probably a commercial pipeline owned by a commercial company, and they have a vested interest in making sure that it doesn't leak in the normal course of events. But when it comes down to who actually owns that from a government perspective and protects it from a government perspective, because it becomes a critical asset to a nation, I think that's something which is being debated at the moment, and it is not an easy one to answer, because at the end of the day, to deliver seabed effect is going to cost money, and government departments are loath to expend money if they don't see it's their responsibility. So I think that's a challenge from almost an administrative point of view going forward, let alone the challenges that operating at 6,000 meters come with by definition.
Yeah, that kind of neatly ties up everything that kind of, I suppose it can be summed up with the fact that operating at the seabed is extremely challenging on lots of levels. So I suppose the last thing to say is thank you for coming on the show and giving our listeners a bit of an insight into some of those challenges, the technologies, and appreciate you coming on.
Harry, it's great. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much indeed. Take care.
The Shephard Defence Podcast was brought to you by Shephard Studio, featuring myself, Harry Lye, and Norbert Neumann, all the way from Florida. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we'd love it if you subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on your favourite podcast player. It really does help us to get the word out about the podcast, and then hopefully more people will get to hear our dulcet tones. Stay tuned for the next episode later in December, but that's all from us for now. Goodbye.